So week 3, but just to keep things, keep the kind of the components of what we're talking about as we talk about reading these Bible stories with a grown-up lens. This week we encounter what may be a familiar Bible story for many of us. And so this is one story in particular then that, like last week with the binding of Isaac, that's one where I don't think there's a child lens to see that story through. So it kind of demands a grown-up lens. The story of Jonah, however, is one that is familiar to us. It's another one that's easy to put in all the children's Bible. Anything that's got an animal in it. I mean, that's going in any children's Bible, right? And so you got this big fish and everything else. But just a reminder, the components for our grown-up lens. So there's that curiosity that it's okay, that we can ask questions, that we can examine and think about even questions that the Bible is not interested in answering. And that's why it's good that you've got a wisdom of a small group. We have other historical resources as well that does the same thing. But it's good to be curious. One of the things that is troubling is anyone with an incurious faith, because that tends to calcify and do a lot more harm than good, both for a person's life, but then also with the way that they encounter or live out their faith. We also want to take the Bible seriously, but not always literally, and so today's story could be another example of that. And we'll pay attention to both the story's historical and biblical context. Just a reminder, and this is what we can do as grown-ups, to know that any story that we encounter in the Bible was originally told and passed on and then edited together in a particular historical time and place. And we can know some things, not everything, but some things or some best guesses about a lot of those times and places. And every biblical story has another context within the canon, within the library of Scripture. So just a reminder to have that. And then there's always the encouragement to apply the Bible's meaning to our own contexts. So we have these stories in a historical context, in a biblical context, and then to make them kind of useful or meaningful for us, we seek to apply them in our own contexts. And I hope that that's something that is useful or something that you're able to do, is particularly in your small groups. So today, it's not about the fish, the story of Jonah. I tried to find the most disgusting picture of... And so one of the things that, I'll highlight this as we walk through the story, that Jonah, if we let it, is a really funny story. If we let it be funny, it'll be funny. If we take ourselves or the story too seriously, it's not going to be funny. And I think we miss some of the depth of meaning and complexity of the story if we don't let it be funny as well. And so that's where even the word that describes what's going on in this picture, we are oftentimes a little too delicate about what it is, but the big fish vomits Jonah out, and that's a gross word because vomit is gross, but it's hilarious too, because when you're not actively in the middle of it, I mean, there are lots of, or you're not a parent trying to keep it in your child in the middle of Christmas worship or whatever. Not that any of this has ever happened to any of us anywhere. So as we start, I hope you had the opportunity to read through the book of Jonah. So just as a starting place, I'll just take a moment to hear from anyone that would like to share something that struck you or that stuck out to you as you read the book of Jonah. Just 42 quick verses, easily read in one sitting if you want. So is there anything that stuck out to you as you read the book of Jonah this time? Yeah, Cheryl?
Well, even Jonah as a prophet,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's listening, and right away he's going, I'm not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he does after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's mad about the
Mm-hmm.
kind of justice that there are, the grace that there are for
Mm-hmm.
people. So I'm thinking, oh, wow, he's pretty much like us.
Mm-hmm.
How he evaluates who deserves to be saved and who doesn't. So, we
Yeah.
I think that kind of sticks up Jonah out from the other prophets. And, I think it is, God's still there with him. So
Right.
he understands, but I just think it is kind of a hilarious story.
Yeah. So Jonah gets called as a prophet. What Cheryl was saying is that he's resistant at first. We'll dig into that a little bit, and then in the end, he's pretty upset about the outcome of his work, and is kind of mad about this grace or this justice that God offers. And in many ways, that may sound kind of like us, that what's good for our goose, we may not particularly want for another's gander. I don't even know where that phrase comes from, but we all know what it means. There's so many phrases like that, right? Like what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, I kind of get it, but it's an odd thing. We don't talk about ganders other than Gander Mountain, but I think that even went out of business. So maybe the gander's really a bad thing. Or you take a gander, whatever. That's not... I'm already off track. Anything else that struck you? Chris?
I think you can go with 3 days and death
Mm-hmm.
and resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at
Yep.
various parts of the story there too.
Yeah, so that the story is that Jonah was in the belly of the big fish for 3 days, and 3 days, we can see as in our Christian story as part of death and resurrection. There, could be resonance there as well. So paying attention to phrases, themes, numbers that occur in different places to say, well, maybe what are the connections there? Good. Anything else? Yeah, Pam?
God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh,
Mm-hmm.
and he has a desert fit, runs away, ends up in a pile of vomit on the beach,
Mm-hmm.
and then God says the same thing. It's
Mhm.
I still want you to do what I want you to do.
Yeah.
Like when a little toddler throws a fit,
Mhm.
bedtime is like, it's still bedtime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that even though I like the hissy fit, God calls Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah says, nuh-uh, and then winds up in, and if you just think about it, what it would have been like, again, we're using our imaginations here to be, because it's not just Jonah that's coming up on the shore here. There's other stuff. So he winds up in a pile of all that. And then God doesn't let him off the hook or give him a different calling. It's like, no, it's still the same thing. You're just kind of gross now. But yeah, so good stuff. And you can take more time and keep unpacking that in your group as well. So I just want to kind of walk through the story to highlight some different themes or point out some details that are maybe less obvious in our English translations than they are in the original languages, and then as much as anything to give you something then as another jumping off point to go and have good conversation in your groups. So who was Jonah? Well, we read in Jonah 1, right at the beginning, the Lord's word came to Jonah, Amittai's son, get up and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their evil has come to my attention. So we know Jonah is a son of someone named Amittai. Great. What does that mean? Not a whole lot. Jonah's a pretty obscure character. The other time he's mentioned in the Old Testament is in 2 Kings chapter 14. And this is during the reign of Jeroboam II in the northern kingdom of Israel. And those verses where Jonah is mentioned read like this. Jeroboam, the son of Israel's king Joash, became king in Samaria in the 15th year of Judah's king Amaziah, Jehoash's son. Lots of good possible names here. So we can have a lot of kids named all these things. He ruled for 41 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. All of the kings of Israel in the northern kingdom were seen as doing evil in the Lord's eyes. He didn't deviate from all the sins that Jeroboam, Nebat's son, had caused Israel to commit. He reestablished Israel's border from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea. This was in agreement with the word that the Lord, the God of Israel, spoke through his servant and the prophet Jonah, Amittai's son, who was from Gath-Hepher. So that's the only time Jonah is mentioned in the Old Testament other than in the book of Jonah. So, for what it's worth. Now, an interesting thing is that in the tradition of Jewish midrash, there was this question, it's not new to us, who was Jonah? So one of the traditions that arose, and you can make of this what you will, is that Jonah was the son of the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17. We don't know if that was true. There's a lot of things we don't know, of course. But it's just one of those imaginative, kind of, again, curious ways that the rabbis played with that to say, well, what might be some threads? Or is there a way to connect some of these characters together? So Jonah, in the end, he was a pretty ambiguous character. And as you've already pointed out, he didn't want to be a prophet, which is kind of the case for everyone who gets called to be a prophet, not only in the Old Testament, but really anytime. Anyone who really embraces the role of being a prophet, run the other way. Because prophets are always sharing difficult news for people to hear. Because if a prophet shows up and just says, carry on, all's great, that's not a prophetic word. And so, of course, it's a terrible job. No one wants to be a prophet, but that doesn't mean no one is a prophet. So he didn't really want to be a prophet, but what compounded it is his particular mission to go to Nineveh was the very, very last thing he wanted to do. So he ran the exact opposite way. So Nineveh was one way. He gets on a boat headed to Tarshish, which is Spain today. And so he wants to get as far away from Nineveh as possible. So here's what we read. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, so that there was a great storm on the sea. The ship looked like it might be broken to pieces. The sailors were terrified, and each one cried out to his God. They hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to make it lighter. Now Jonah had gone down into the hold of the vessel to lie down and was deep in sleep. I heard one person laugh, which is good, because I think it's pretty funny. Everyone else is getting tossed and everything's getting turned. They're trying to get rid of the cargo. They're trying to be safe. And then Jonah is like in a coma, comfortably ensconced down in the ship. And so there's this contrast is intentional in the story. Then what's also interesting is as it goes on, so later on, Jonah does cop to being, okay, I'm the reason why this is happening because I'm running away from God. Then they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. Interestingly, Jonah 1:16, the men, so those who were just praying to their other gods when the storm was raging and Jonah was deep asleep, the men worshiped the Lord with a profound reverence. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made solemn promises. So already, Jonah is clearly trying to run away and refuse and repudiate God's calling for him. And what we also see is he is by far the most effective prophet in the Old Testament. Everywhere he goes, he's getting people to turn to the Lord. And so even though his witness was nothing more than, hi, it's me, I'm the problem, it's me, throw me overboard, they all then wind up worshiping God, which is fascinating detail. Another detail that is, I think, interesting to note is not only is Jonah running away, but within his story of running away, he's continually going down. So we read in verse 3 these are all from chapter 1. So Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship headed for Tarshish. He paid the fare and went aboard to go to them to Tarshish away from the Lord. So he goes down to Joppa. Now Jonah had gone down into the hold of the vessel to lie down and was deep in sleep. And then we read in verse 15, then they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, which is down off of the ship. And the sea ceased its raging. And then verse 17, meanwhile, the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish, which is even further down, for 3 days and 3 nights. So maybe there's something to that. What does that trajectory of going down, 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 down mean for Jonah? Is there something there that is suggestive? Now, this is just a fun fact, and one I wasn't really aware of before, but the gender of the fish changes throughout the story. And so in chapter 1, verse 17, when the fish first comes and swallows, it's the word dag, which is the masculine verb, so that's used for a male fish. And then in chapter 2, verse 1, it's daga, which is the feminine form. It's what's used for a female fish. And then by the end of the story, it's the word is dag again, the masculine form of. So I don't, so there's either what to make of this. I don't know, but there's a midrash tradition because it's not like the people who are writing or editing this story were unaware that they were using a different word. But then they weren't available for comment later on. So again, in the midrash tradition, they're trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? How do we make sense of this change? And this isn't like a big deal or anything. I mean, I don't think anyone's faith necessarily rests on this. It's just a way to be playful and fun with the story. And so this is from the midrash tradition. It comes out of the Jewish Encyclopedia. But this is what the midrash says. Thus Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, but would not pray. God then resolved to put him into another fish where he would be less comfortable. So like the first fish was, that was like the sweet. And it's like, no, you need, you got to go back. You're not sitting in first class anymore. You got to be back next to the bathroom. And so a female fish, quick with young, approached the male fish in which Jonah was, threatening to devour both unless Jonah were transferred to her, and announcing her divine orders to that effect. Then Jonah was ejected from one fish into the overfilled belly of the other. Cramped for room and otherwise made miserable, Jonah finally prayed, acknowledging the futility of his efforts to escape from God. Which is just, we don't just have one, we got 2 fish now. But and just to think about, it's like midair rescues, when you try to get from one plane. I don't know how this would work. How does the fish and Jonah, it's imaginative. That's why we're, and so we're engaging, and actually being playful with the Bible is taking it seriously, because it means that we're engaging it, especially a story like this, on the level that it wants to be. Trying to take it literally, we run into problems like, okay, there are these words that don't line up, so then we have to spend all this energy trying to make it all make sense rather than just kind of having fun and rolling with it and not making it a big hairy deal. And then another idea, just as this story of Jonah gets edited together, and it kind of connects with this, is that the prayer that's at the beginning of chapter 2 wasn't really, kind of seen as Jonah's prayer, that it was likely a pre-existing prayer that was inserted in this point of the story, because it's a thanksgiving for deliverance rather than a prayer of repentance. And so if you pay attention to the prayer itself, it just kind of feels a little bit off, because, he's in the belly of the fish giving thanks for being delivered, from what? And so just kind of, again, interesting when we pay attention to those details. So you could think about how or why would that prayer make sense in that place, and what does it say, and can kind of play with the story in those ways. All right. So, often that's where the weight of the story lands, is right up until when Jonah gets belched out onto the seashore, because it's the fish and that's the fun thing. But that's really not the point of the story. That's why the chapter is called "It's Not About the Fish." So then we get to kind of the heart of the story here. With what we could call a Ninevite revival, and I would also call possibly the worst sermon ever. Again, the story's funny if we let it be. if we let it be. Because I think it probably just reflects poorly on me, but maybe you're like me. So maybe then it reflects poorly on you as well. Like, I have a hard time remembering the best sermons I've heard, but I could tell you the worst 5 sermons I've heard in my life. And it might just be because of my line of work. But I can tell you, and I could probably tell you the 5 worst I've given, and you could probably tell me the 5 worst I've given too. But this one maybe takes the cake. The Lord's word came to Jonah a second time. This is what I think Pam was pointing out. Like, okay, he throws the hissy fit, winds up in a pile of goo on the beach, and God's like, it's a rerun. It's the same message. Get up and go to Nineveh, that great city, and declare against it the proclamation that I am commanding you. And Jonah got up and went to Nineveh according to the Lord's word. Now, Nineveh was indeed an enormous city, a 3 days walk across. So the Ninevites were huge enemies of the Israelites and of Jonah. So he hated the Ninevites. He didn't want them to repent. He wanted them to he wanted God to smite them all. There's no such thing as a good Ninevite in his estimation. But Jonah knew where resisting God's call had been getting him. So in verse 4 of chapter 3, we read, Jonah started into the city walking one day. So it's 3 days walk across, so he gets a third of the way in. And he cried out. And I don't know if he cried out. It sounds, as I read this, it feels more like he seethed this out, muttered maybe. And so here's his entire sermon. Just 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's it. That's his sermon. I'm going to try that this weekend. I'm going to get up and preach that. But look at the outcome. Verse 5, and the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast and put on mourning clothes from the greatest of them to the least significant. The worst sermon ever, and 100% effective. Not only the people repented, but the animals were repenting too. That's apparently an effective message for Nineveh that day. And then we're aware enough, we've read this story and we understand that this does not make Jonah happy. He didn't want these people to repent. He wanted them just removed. But we see that God responds with compassion and mercy. They turn to God, and God changes God's mind. God saw what they were doing, that they had ceased their evil behavior, so God stopped planning to destroy them, and God didn't do it. So then what we have is the story continuing to build, because then we get to chapter 4, which is the highlight of what's going on, because it's all building to this. Because the story may not really be about the big fish. It may not even be about the Ninevites and their repentance. It may actually be about Jonah and his response to God's call and God's character. So we get to chapter 4, and we see Jonah's anger raging. But Jonah thought that this was utterly wrong, and he became angry. He did not like the policy decision God had made about Nineveh. Jonah prayed to the Lord. Now here's a prayer for you. We heard his sermon. All right, now we're ready for his prayer. Come on, Lord. Wasn't this precisely my point when I was back in my own land? This is why I fled to Tarshish earlier. I know that you are merciful and compassionate, God, very patient, full of faithful love and willing not to destroy. At this point, Lord, you may as well take my life from me, because it would be better for me to die than to live. Amen, right? And so, it's quite an accusatory prayer. So first of all, this is a prayer and it's in the Bible, so God can take it. Hopefully we're aware that God can take our prayers when we're bent out of shape, when we're struggling, when we're even mad at God. We can tell God these things and God will embrace it. Especially because if we do trust that God is as wise as I think we generally do, God kind of already knows, so we're not fooling God. And so I appreciate the candor and the honesty that Jonah offers here in his prayer. But what this can get us to start peeking at is to thinking, because I think one of the most faithful ways to engage this story, especially by this point, is to put ourselves in Jonah's spot. What are those times when we've wanted to pray like that, when we've actually been resentful that God is the way God is, because there's something that God is willing to do for people that we don't like, or that God's grace is bigger than we're really comfortable with? It's what Cheryl was getting at when we started. And so we have God responding then in verse 4. The Lord responded, "Is your anger a good thing?" But Jonah went out from the city and sat down east of the city. I just see him kind of pouting off, I think Pam was talking about the toddler throwing a fit, and we kind of have Jonah stomping off east of the city. There he made himself a hut and sat under it in the shade to see what would happen to the city. There's an important detail there, that he was heading east. Heading eastward in the Bible is never a good thing. When Adam and Eve had to leave the garden in Eden, they headed east. When Cain had killed Abel and needed to go out on his way, he headed further east. The Tower of Babel came when there was this great eastward expansion, and the people wanted to build the tower to be like God. And so then one of the things that Josh Scott says is that east in the Bible is away from our true humanity, away from human flourishing and being all that we were made to be. So that's what movement to the east represents, is moving away from who we truly are, for who God has made us to be. That's one of the themes that comes up time and again. Whenever someone's moving east, they're moving not just away from God, but moving away from their true humanity as well. But even though Jonah heads east, stomps his way over there and is sitting in this hut, God still provides. And again, if we let it be, it's funny. So we read in Jonah 4, starting at verse 6, "Then the Lord provided a shrub, and it grew up over Jonah, providing shade for his head and saving him from his misery." Have you ever had those days, like out in the sun and there's just no trees, there's no cover around, and it's just the heat is just, it's usually you're at the state fair, and the heat is just penetrating and it's just oppressive, and any sort of relief is just incredible. Well, here it comes. There's a shrub saving him from his misery. Jonah was very happy about the shrub. Who knew that happiness was an emotion Jonah could feel? But here it is. Jonah was happy. But God provided a worm the next day at dawn. This is funny. And it attacked the shrub so that it died. Then as the sun rose, God provided a dry east wind. Interesting. So it's actually an east wind, of course, is coming from the other direction, because it's coming from the east to the west. And the sun beat down on Jonah's head so that he became faint. He begged that he might die. There's the Jonah we know, saying, "It's better for me to die than to live." That's like his life verse right there. He's already said it twice, in his prayer to God, and then he reiterates, "It'd be better for me to die than to live." He'd rather die than have the Ninevites, not die, and he would rather die than have to face this heat. And then God said to Jonah, "Is your anger about the shrub a good thing?" Jonah said, "Yes, my anger is good, even to the point of death." That's quite a response. Again, we probably don't want to broadcast that, but in our lives, has that ever been something we've thought? Has our anger been something we've felt is really good, even to the point of death? Is that how much we would want to hold on to our anger about something or another? But the Lord said, "You pitied the shrub for which you didn't work and which you didn't raise. It grew in a night and perished in a night. Yet for my part, can't I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who can't tell their right hand from the left, and also many animals?" So kind of an interesting thought there. And that's where the book of Jonah ends, with that question. So, first, to talk about this central biblical narrative that shows up in the book of Jonah. It shows up all over the place as we read and engage the Bible. First, there's this consistent encouragement to see God, ourselves, and others, especially our enemies, in a new way. That yes, we know Jesus teaches, love your enemies. And yes, that's a verse we don't like to think about. But it's here in Jonah as well. This idea of seeing God, ourselves, and others in a new way, and seeing our enemies in a new way. Now, this historical context piece is important, that historically Nineveh, there's no stories of Nineveh ever repenting or changing. There's never a story of the city turning to God at any point. This story of Jonah came to be both after Israel fell, and then even after the city of Nineveh fell. So by this point, when the story came to be, they were both used to be's. And so one of the ways that this story of Jonah can be seen in the city of Nineveh's story is to have this story of these two used to be's, but the story of Jonah shows what could have been. So just one possible way to engage and think about, maybe there are other stories that we're aware of where there are those pieces of where what if history had taken a different turn? What would have happened? So then just some thoughts that Josh Scott, the author of that book, Bible Story for Grown-Ups, offers about this. The book of Jonah calls us to see not just our own people, whether it's religion, nation, and so on, not just our own people as worthy of love and care, but all humans everywhere. It invites us to see our species, not just our group, as our responsibility. And so one of the things he also says is what we always get to decide is how we will be an enemy. One of the things you could even do in your group is think about, or you could even pull up on your phones or if you got your tablets, just a map of the world, but one that has the national borders superimposed on it. And we're all aware that those are human-created borders between any country or even between states, between any of these things. Those are all superimposed by humans onto creation. And what does that make us think about versus seeing the world without any of those? Just knowing that that's, the one is what we created, the other is what God created. And is there a conversation there? Does it feel different to see things in those ways? So then, just kind of as a last thought, to get back to that open-ended ending, but the Lord said, "But you pitied the shrub for which you didn't work and which you didn't raise. It grew in a night and perished in a night, yet for my part, can't I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who can't tell their right hand from the left, and also many animals?" And so the word pitied here is the same as had compassion on. And so this is demonstration of compassion. So it's interesting. Jonah has compassion for the shrub. He's really heartbroken that his beloved one-day-old shrub died. And God's saying, okay, well, let's scale things here. If you've got compassion for that shrub, can't I have compassion for all of these people and animals? So let's not discount the animals here either. So why this cliffhanger? I mean, maybe one of the things you can think about in your group is if there are novels or movies or TV shows that end with cliffhangers, and then what that means. Like, did you experience that as satisfying or not? Because that's a narrative device. There's a reason, there's an intention, especially when you end a story with a cliffhanger. So why in this case? Well, I would say it's to provoke us to consider, who are our Ninevites? Who are your Ninevites? And how will you respond to them? So Scott asks, will we participate in petty back and forth passive aggression? Will we seek to have the last word or cause harm? Will we hate our enemies to our own destruction? Will we be swallowed up by hate and bigotry? Will we experience the self-induced exile that refusing to seek peace and understanding will lead to? So are we going to take the Jonah path, or maybe are we going to think that God's onto something here? And interestingly, there are a couple other very notable biblical cliffhangers, again, used for that same purpose. At the end of the parable of the lost sons, at the end of Luke 15, we know what happens with the younger son, the one who had gone out and wasted all of his inheritance. But the cliffhanger, and that's why I like calling it the parable of the lost sons, not just the lost son, because actually the one was lost and now is found, and now we've got a famous hymn about it. That's Amazing Grace, by the way. But we don't know what happens with the older son, because he's kind of like Jonah. He's pouting outside the party, and we don't know if he goes into the party or not. And that's part of Jesus telling the parable of the lost son. Like, are you going to be out here and pout in your self-righteousness? Or do you want to come inside and join the party where all the fun's at? And then at the very end of Mark's gospel, the original ending of Mark's gospel, and this is an example of how uncomfortable cliffhangers can be, is that not only did one, but two different other endings get added to Mark's gospel later on because people didn't like the fact that it originally ended with a cliffhanger. And the way it ended with a cliffhanger, which is why, I mean, like, you're never going to hear Mark 16 in its original version on Easter Sunday, or probably not. That's why it's not in the Revised Common Lectionary, because here's how it ends. So this is after the young man in white on a robe seated at the side. He saw the women who were there. He said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him." The young man goes on to say, "Go, tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you." But then the last verse in the original ending of Mark's gospel goes like this: "Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." Which, of course, on one level we know isn't true. Because if they said nothing to anyone, we wouldn't have the story, right? But as a literary device, one of the reasons why Mark may have used that cliffhanger ending was to, again, provoke us as the hearers of his gospel. Will we go and say nothing, or will we go and share the good news? So just, again, to think through, oftentimes those cliffhangers, especially biblically, are to put us within the story and consider what would we do, or what, not just would we do, but what do we do when we're in these different situations. So hopefully you got something to talk about in your group. Next week, if you want to do your homework, we are going to talk about Jesus in unexpected places, the parable of the tenants. So kind of a difficult parable of Jesus, but we'll work through that. We did our 3 weeks of the Old Testament. We got our 3 weeks of the New Testament coming up. Blessings on your conversations, everyone.